Good morning, Miss. Good morning, classmates. Today, we will discuss the case concerning the difference between New Zealand and France arising from the Rainbow Warrior affair. In this presentation, we will discuss the facts, issues, holdings, rationale, dicta, dissent, parties' argument, and comments of the case. Subject of dispute. On the 10th of July 1985, a civilian vessel, the Rainbow Warrior, was sunk at its moorings in Auckland Harbour, New Zealand. The damage was caused by two high explosive devices. The attack against the Rainbow Warrior was carried out under the official orders by a team of agents from the Directorate General of External Security, an agency of the French government. A communique issued by the then Prime Minister of France confirms that France is responsible for this action. On the 12th of July 1985, two agents from France were interviewed by the New Zealand police and were arrested. On the 4th of July 1985, the two pleaded guilty in the district court in Auckland to charges of manslaughter and willful damage to a ship by means of explosives. On the 22nd of November 1985, both Maffard and Prior were sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. The attempt to resolve the issue dispute by negotiation began in September 1985, following a meeting in New York between New Zealand Deputy Prime Minister and the then French Minister of External Affairs. The violation of international law. The attack against Rainbow Warrior was a serious violation of international law. It is a serious violation of the New Zealand's sovereignty and the Charter of the United Nations. These violations were not accidental or technical. There is no doubt that the attacks was authorized and funded at a high level. The purpose of the operation was to execute a criminal act of violence against the property of the New Zealand without any regard to innocent civilians. As the purpose was achieved, the consequence was death of an innocent civilian. Reparations sought by New Zealand. First, apology. The government of New Zealand is entitled, in accordance to the international law, a formal and unqualified apology for the violation of its sovereignty and rights. France has expressed its compliance. Therefore, the ruling is that the Prime Minister of France should convey to the Prime Minister of New Zealand a formal and unqualified apology for the attack. Compensation. The large-scale police investigation on the criminal activity in New Zealand incurred substantial costs in various government agencies. Under international law, the New Zealand is entitled to reimbursed by France of all costs which are direct result of France's unlawful acts. In respect to all the damage suffered, New Zealand believes that it is entitled for a compensation no less than $9 million for the damage to the vessel, and compensation in respect to the death of its crewman. The New Zealand believed that the family of the dead man should also receive fair compensation. In addition to this, New Zealand also indicated that settlement should only be possible if there are binding agreements in place. In response to the demands of New Zealand, France agreed to pay for the compensation, but France asserted that it will pay no less than $4 million. For the rulings, French government should pay the sum of $7 million as compensation for all the damages the New Zealand has suffered. The concern for prisoner transfer of the two agents. For New Zealand, sinking Rainbow Warrior is a grave offense, a breach of international law, and a commission of a serious crime. The New Zealand asserts that the release of the two agents will undermine the integrity of the New Zealand's judicial system. On the other hand, France asserted that it would not do its part to hold up the end of the bargain, as it does not have the law that will subject the two agents to criminal proceedings. In addition, the French government also seeks the immediate return of the two agents, as their imprisonment is unjustified, for they only work under orders. The ruling is that the two agents will be transferred into an isolated island for 3 years under prohibition from leaving the land except under mutual consent of two governments.
Now let's talk about the issues. What is in dispute? How it started. On July 10, 1985, an undercover operation conducted by the French Military Security Service, DGSE, sank the Dutch-registered Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior, berthed in Auckland Harbour, killing a Dutch photographer, Fernando Pereira. Two of the agents, Major Marfart and Captain Perrier, were subsequently arrested in New Zealand and having pleaded guilty to charges of manslaughter and criminal damage, and were sentenced by a New Zealand court to 10 years imprisonment. A dispute rose between France, which demanded the release of the two agents, and New Zealand, which claimed the compensation for the incident. New Zealand also complained that France was threatening to disrupt New Zealand's trade with the European communities unless the two agents were released. The two countries requested that the Secretary General of the United Nations to mediate and propose a solution in the form of a ruling, which both parties agreed in advance to accept. The Secretary General's ruling, which was given in 1986, required France to pay $7 million to New Zealand to undertake not to take certain defined measures injurious to New Zealand trade with the European communities. The ruling also provided that Major Marfart and Captain Prieur were to be released in French custody, but were to spend the next 3 years on an isolated French military base in the Pacific. The two states concluded an agreement in the form of an exchange of letters on July 9, 1986, noted as the First Agreement, which provided the implementation of the ruling. Under the terms of the First Agreement, Major Marfart and Captain Pierre were to be transferred to a French military on the island of Hao for a period of not less than 3 years. They will also be prohibited from leaving the island for any reason except with the mutual consent of the two governments.
Parties' argument between New Zealand government and France. With regards to the situation that happened to the Rainbow Warrior, the France recognized its responsibility from the effects of the attack. New Zealand and French government had meetings and discussed the dispute by negotiations among each other, but didn't lead to an agreement. For the New Zealand argument, first, the New Zealand government demanded a formal and unqualified apology from France for violations of sovereignty and rights under international law. According to them, the attack against Rainbow Warrior is a serious violation of basic norms of international law, specifically violations of New Zealand's sovereignty and of Charter of United Nations. The operation resulted to a criminal act of violence against property in New Zealand that led to a death of an innocent civilian. Second, New Zealand demanded a compensation of no less than $9 million. The total compensation that the New Zealand government asked for concludes the costs incurred by the various government agencies, violation of sovereignty, affront and insults, as well as other damages that the country had suffered. Third, New Zealand believes that the sinking of Rainbow Warrior is a breach of international law and is considered to be a serious crime in New Zealand. If two French agents would be released to freedom, it will undermine the integrity of New Zealand's judicial system. However, through negotiations, New Zealand is considering possibilities of prisoners serving sentence outside New Zealand. On the other hand, for the first opposition, French government argues that France did not cause any material damage to New Zealand. However, they admitted that they had caused moral damage that may be compensated by offering regrets or apologies. Second, the formal and unconditional offer of apologies by France compensates for the moral damage suffered by New Zealand, and this damage could not, in addition, be the object of an economic penalty. Moreover, the compensation for the France only owed would be the damages suffered directly by the New Zealand, excluding the Greenpeace organization and the family of Mr. Fernando Pereira. Third, the French government seeks immediate return of the two officers. According to them, imprisonment in New Zealand is not justified because of the fact that they had acted under military orders. and the France had already agreed to give an apology and to pay compensation to the damage they had caused to New Zealand.
From the attack carried out by French service agents under official orders against a civilian vessel in New Zealand, there were reports of damage and manslaughter. With the reparations for New Zealand in form of apologies and compensations, France also requests for the return of the agents. From this information, rulings were decided by the Secretary General regarding this matter to settle the case. We will now dissect the rulings provided. The rulings are as follows. First is a formal and an unqualified apology. France will give a formal and an unqualified apology to New Zealand as it seeks one. Second is a compensation that amounts to 7 million US dollars. The French government should pay this amount to the government of New Zealand. This became the ruling after presenting the requests of both parties. Third is about the imprisonment. The imprisonment in New Zealand seems to not be justified as reflected in the French government's seeking of the return of the two officers. Therefore, there was a ruling that was decided. First is about the transfer. New Zealand should transfer Major Alain, Maffard, and Captain Dominic to the French military authorities. Transferred to a military facility on an isolated island outside of Europe for 3 years. Next is about the permission. Officers should be prohibited to leave the island for any reason, except with the mutual consent of both governments. They should be isolated during the assignment other than military or associated personnel and immediate family and friends. With this, contact with the press or media is also prohibited. This decision should be strictly enforced. Next is about the reports. The French government should convey every 3 months to the government of New Zealand and to the Secretary General of the United Nations, through diplomatic channels, full reports on the situation of the officers for an assurance of implementation. Next is about the visit. A visit to the French military facility may be made if requested by the New Zealand government, but with mutual agreements and agreed third party. Next is about the island. Transfer of both officers is believed to be best done on the isolated island of Hao in French Polynesia for better enforcement of conditions mentioned from A to D. This would be the destination immediately after transfer as per ruling. From the attack carried out by French service agents under official orders against a civilian vessel in New Zealand, there were reports of damage and manslaughter. With the reparations for New Zealand in form of apologies and compensations, France also requests for the return of the agents. From this information, rulings were decided by the Secretary General regarding this matter to settle the case. We will now dissect the rulings provided. The rulings are as follows. First is a formal and an unqualified apology. France will give a formal and an unqualified apology to New Zealand as it seeks one. Second is a compensation that amounts to 7 million US dollars. The French government should pay this amount to the government of New Zealand. This became the ruling after presenting the requests of both parties. Third is about the imprisonment. The imprisonment in New Zealand seems to not be justified as reflected in the French government's seeking of the return of the two officers. Therefore, there was a ruling that was decided. First is about the transfer. New Zealand should transfer Major Alain, Maffard, and Captain Dominic to the French military authorities. Transferred to a military facility on an isolated island outside of Europe for 3 years. Next is about the permission. Officers should be prohibited to leave the island for any reason, except with the mutual consent of both governments. They should be isolated during the assignment other than military or associated personnel and immediate family and friends. With this, contact with the press or media is also prohibited. This decision should be strictly enforced. Next is about the reports. The French government should convey every 3 months to the government of New Zealand and to the Secretary General of the United Nations, through diplomatic channels, full reports on the situation of the officers for an assurance of implementation. Next is about the visit. A visit to the French military facility may be made if requested by the New Zealand government, but with mutual agreements and agreed third party. Next is about the island. Transfer of both officers is believed to be best done on the isolated island of Howe in French Polynesia for better enforcement of conditions mentioned from A to D. This would be the destination immediately after transfer as per ruling.
Rationale. The violation of New Zealand territory by France did not in itself cause any material damage to New Zealand. On the other hand, it may be admitted that it has caused it moral damage which, according to international law, may be compensated by the offer of regrets or apologies. The government of New Zealand requests the French government to offer it such apologies. The French government is prepared to make compensation in this manner for the moral damage suffered by New Zealand, and the French Prime Minister is ready, therefore, to address to the New Zealand Prime Minister a formal and unconditional letter of apology for the attack carried out on the 10th of July, 1985. The request for compensation presented by New Zealand also appears to be justified in its principle, and the French government is prepared to pay to the New Zealand government a global lump sum indemnity compensating for all the damage suffered directly by New Zealand. The sum of $9 million put forward by the New Zealand side, however, appears in this perspective altogether. In the first instance, the indemnity owing could only be compensated for the damages suffered by New Zealand. On this point, moreover, the two governments are in full agreement. This being the case, the formal and unconditional offer of apologies by France compensates for the moral damage suffered by New Zealand, and this damage could not, in addition, be the object of pecuniary compensation.
The case between France and New Zealand arising from the Rainbow Warrior affair takes a long time to settle. It talks about a civilian vessel, without flying the New Zealand flag, sunk at Auckland Harbour, New Zealand, and was damaged by two high explosives. A Netherlands citizen was drowned when the ship sank. Since it was a breach of international law and the commission of serious crimes in New Zealand, the two suspects were imprisoned in New Zealand under New Zealand court. But the French government wants the immediate return of the two officers who were imprisoned in New Zealand. After several negotiations, France agreed to make compensation and issue letter of apology as requested by New Zealand. However, part of the compensation that New Zealand demanded was disbursement not less than 9 million dollars, while France argued to give not more than 4 million dollars. If this can't be settled, it is better to stand between 4 and 9 million dollars as compensation because the dispute will delay further. As to the two French service agents that were imprisoned and prosecuted, since two countries have different laws to follow, it is better to follow laws of that country where the accident took place as they suffered a lot of damages. On the other hand, France wants to cut importation or any trade from New Zealand which is not related to the dispute matter. And business is a different matter from the crime that occurred as it was an order already from the court. France should be responsible to the matter as well as the loss of the innocent victims. Lastly, why did France carry out the attack of the Rainbow Warrior since they were known traditionally as friends and allies with New Zealand? As such, the attack was considered a violation of the territorial sovereignty of New Zealand, and it is also a violation of international law. Hence, New Zealand has the right to compensation for the harm they suffered directly from the attack and the right to follow their country's law.